The Arizona sun beats down with a merciless fury, forging the landscape in a crucible of heat and dust. Out here, the line between survival and a shallow grave is as thin as a whisper. For young Jedediah Stone, a man already acquainted with death, that line was about to be crossed. He was just a solitary rancher, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past, when he found a dying Apache in a dried-up creek bed. Taking him in was an act of madness, a betrayal of his own history. But in that one fateful decision, Jedediah set in motion a chain of events that would culminate a week later with a host of warriors surrounding his ranch. Not with weapons of war, but with a sacred gift that would redefine the very meaning of justice and mercy in the unforgiving heart of the West. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on Jedediah Stone's shoulders as he rode the fence line of his ranch the stone's throw. It was a lonely stretch of land, carved out of the rugged Arizona territory, a place where the sun baked the earth into a cracked and thirsty mosaic. Jedediah, or Jed, as most knew him, was a young man. But the harshness of the land and a past steeped in tragedy had etched lines of premature age around his eyes. He was 24, but felt 100. His only companion on this sprawling, isolated ranch was Gus, a man whose face was a road map of wrinkles, each one telling a story of survival in the unforgiving West. Gus had been with Jed's father, and when a Comanche raid had stolen his family away years ago, Gus had stayed. He was as much a part of the ranch as the weathered barn and the stoic, enduring mesas that watched over them. It was in a dried-up creek bed, a place of bleached stones and skeletal remains of long-dead scrub, that Jed's solitary routine was shattered. He saw a splash of color against the pale earth, a broken human form lying in the scant shade of a mesquite tree. His hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a chilling reality. An Apache man grievously wounded, his breathing shallow and ragged. He wore no war paint, but the very sight of him, an Apache on his land, was enough to ignite the embers of a long, smoldering hatred in Jed's heart. The Comanches had come at dawn, their war cries a symphony of death that had torn his world apart. He had been just a boy hidden in the root cellar by his mother, her last loving act before she was. He shook his head, pushing the memories back into the dark corners of his mind, where they festered. His first instinct, now raw and visceral, was to draw his pistol and end this. One less Apache in the world. It would be a small, belated act of vengeance, a balm on a wound that would never truly heal. He dismounted the dust puffing up around his worn leather boots. The Apache's eyes flickered open dark pools of pain and defiance. There was no plea for mercy in them, only a stoic acceptance of his fate. That more than anything gave Jed pause. Jedediah Gus's voice, rough as gravel, cut through the tense silence. The old ranch hand had ridden up behind him, his expression a mixture of caution and concern. "What in blazes are you thinking? I'm thinking of finishing what was started." Jed spat, his voice tight with a venom he rarely let surface. Gus dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the wounded Apache, then back at Jed. "That's a fool's thought, boy, and you know it. This ain't a warrior. Look at him. And killing a man in this state ain't justice, it's murder. Besides, you kill him here on your land, and his people will come looking. They'll find him, and then they'll find us. You want a war with the Apache? Because that's how you get one." Jed's hand trembled, his finger hovering over the trigger. The face of the dying man blurred, and for a fleeting moment he saw the face of the Comanche warrior who had... He flinched, the image too painful to bear. Gus was right. The pragmatic truth of his words cut through the haze of Jed's anger. He couldn't risk a war. Not for this. With a curse, he holstered his pistol. "Then what do we do, Gus? Just leave him here to be buzzard food." "There's the old line shack up near the north pasture," Gus suggested. "It's secluded. We take him there. Out of sight, out of mind. Let nature take its course." It was a compromise Jed could live with. He wouldn't be the executioner, but he wouldn't be a savior either. He would let fate decide. Together they loaded the semi-conscious Apache onto Jed's horse. The man was light, his body wiry and tough, but the journey to the line shack was a slow and arduous one. They left him on a dusty cot inside the small, dilapidated cabin with a canteen of water and a block of hardtack that Jed knew he was too weak to eat. As they rode away, Jed didn't look back. He wanted to forget the Apache existed. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jed was in the barn tending to his horse. He reached into his saddlebag to retrieve a brush, and his fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It was a small, weathered leather pouch, undoubtedly fallen from the Apache's loincloth during the rough transport. Jed's first thought was to throw it in the fire. But a flicker of curiosity, a trait he usually suppressed, got the better of him. He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his calloused palm. It wasn't a weapon or a piece of turquoise or any of the trinkets he might have expected. It was a crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched in mid-flight. Jed's breath hitched in his throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was almost identical to a bird his own father had carved for him a lifetime ago before the fire and the screams. He still had it tucked away in a small wooden box with the few other remnants of his childhood. The sight of this small, insignificant object, so intimately tied to his own loss in the possession of a man he had left to die, was a shock that went deeper than any physical blow. It was a crack in the dam of his hatred, a fissure through which a sliver of unwelcome light was beginning to penetrate. The world was no longer as simple as black and white, as settler and savage. For the first time in a long time, Jedediah Stone was truly lost. The days that followed were a blur of inner turmoil for Jed. He tried to immerse himself in the grueling work of the ranch to sweat out the image of the wooden bird and the dying man in the line shack. But the memory was a persistent burr under his saddle, a constant nagging presence. He told himself he was a fool, that it was a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But the feeling, the unsettling sense of a connection he couldn't explain wouldn't leave him. Against his better judgment, he found himself riding out to the line shack every day. At first he told himself it was just to see if the Apache was dead yet. But when he found the man against all odds, still clinging to life, a strange and unwelcome sense of responsibility began to take root. He started leaving fresh water, then a bowl of broth from the ranch house kitchen. He did it all in secret, not even telling Gus, ashamed of this inexplicable crack in his armor of indifference. The Apache, whose name Jed learned was Nakai, was slowly, almost imperceptibly beginning to heal. He was still weak, his body a canvas of pain, but the fever in his eyes had begun to recede. They communicated in a broken mixture of gestures and a few Spanish words that both men knew. It was a tense and fragile dialogue, a dance of suspicion and grudging respect. Jed learned that Nakai was not a warrior, but a scout from a band of Apache known as the White Mountain Apache. He had been tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on their people's goats when he was ambushed. And here came the first surprise, for Jed Nakai's attackers were not white men. They were Chiricahua Apache, a rival band known for their ferocity and their bitter enmity with the White Mountain people. This piece of information chipped away another piece of Jed's preconceived notions. The world of the Apache was as complex and fraught with its own alliances and rivalries as the world of the white settlers. As Nakai's strength returned, a quiet routine developed between the two men. Jed would bring food and fresh bandages, and Nakai would watch him with those dark, unreadable eyes. One day, Jed, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, pulled the small wooden bird from his pocket and held it out to Nakai. "Why do you have this?" Jed asked, his voice rough. Nakai looked at the bird, and a flicker of something, perhaps sadness, crossed his face. He pointed to his own chest, then made a gesture that indicated a child. "My son," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Gone." He then pointed at Jed, then at the bird, a silent question in his eyes. Jed, his throat tight, pulled out his own bird, the one his father had carved. He placed them side by side on the dusty floor of the shack. They were not identical, but they were carved with the same love, the same simple, heartfelt artistry. In that moment, the chasm between them, the chasm of race and culture and history, seemed to shrink. They were just two men, two fathers who had lost their sons, united in a grief that transcended language. But the fragile piece of the Stone's Throw Ranch was about to be shattered. News like a wildfire in the dry season travels fast in the West, and the news of an Apache on Jed's land had reached the ears of Phineas Finn O'Doherty, a neighboring rancher whose ambition was as vast as the land he coveted. Finn was a boorish, loud-mouthed man with a deep-seated hatred for all Native Americans. He had long had his eye on Jed's ranch with its precious water rights, a lifeblood in this arid land. Finn saw an opportunity. He rode into the nearby town of Redemption, a dusty collection of saloons, a general store, and a blacksmith's shop, and began to spin his venomous tale. He spoke of Jed as a red lover, an Indian sympathizer, a traitor to his own kind. He played on the fears of the townsfolk, fears that were never far from the surface in a land where the memory of raids and massacres was still fresh. Gus, his ear always to the ground, heard the whispers, the growing tide of resentment against Jed. He rode back to the ranch, his face grim. "Jedediah, you got trouble comin'," he said, his voice low. "Finn O'Doherty is stirring up a hornet's nest in town. He's talking of forming a posse of coming out here to deal with your Apache friend. And what's more, he's been seen talking to Kind Miller from Fort Grant. You know Miller's ambition, his desire to make a name for himself. An Indian uprising on a local ranch would be just the excuse he needs." Jed's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the man in the line shack, on the ghost of his own past, that he had forgotten the dangers of the present. He was caught in a trap of his own making. To hand Nakai over to a mob or to the likes of Kind Miller was a death sentence. But to keep him here to protect him was to invite a war he could not possibly win. The fragile truce he had forged with Nakai was about to be tested by fire. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was about to break, and Jedediah Stone was standing right in its path. The town of Redemption was a tinderbox, and Finn O'Doherty was striking matches with gleeful abandon. He stood on the porch of the saloon, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his voice booming across the dusty street. He painted a picture of Jedediah Stone as a dangerous eccentric, a man who had turned his back on his own people, who was harboring a savage, a murderer on his land. Sheriff Brody Hayes listened from the doorway of his office, his face a mask of weary resignation. Brody was a man caught between the law and the will of the people, a tightrope he had walked for 20 years. He was a good man, a fair man, but he was also a pragmatic one. He knew that the fear of the Apache ran deep in this territory, a primal fear that could easily be whipped into a frenzy of violence. He had known Jed's father a good man who had been a friend, and he had seen the light go out of young Jed's eyes after the Comanche raid. He understood the boy's hatred, the deep well of his pain. But this was something different. This was a lynch mob in the making, and Finn O'Doherty was its self-appointed leader. Sheriff O'Doherty's voice, slurred with whiskey and self-importance, called out, "What are you going to do about this? We got a man here, a so-called white man, who's siding with the Redskins against his own. It ain't right. It ain't safe." A chorus of drunken agreement rose from the crowd that had gathered around O'Doherty. Brody sighed, straightened his hat, and walked out into the street. "Now, Finn," he said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to O'Doherty's blustering. "You know as well as I do that Jed Stone is a good man. He's just been through a lot. Let's not jump to conclusions." "Conclusions," O'Doherty scoffed. "The conclusion is that he's got an Apache on his land. A killer. What if he's part of a war party scouting us out, ready to attack? We got to protect ourselves. If you ain't gonna do it, Sheriff, then we will." The crowd roared its approval. Brody knew he was losing control. He needed to get to the Stone's Throw ranch to find out what was really going on. He deputized a young, eager-to-please man named Charlie, and together they rode out of town, leaving O'Doherty to his rabble-rousing. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Jed was facing his own dilemma. Gus had just returned from a trip to the general store, his face grim. "It's worse than I thought, Jed," he said, his voice low. "Finn's got half the town believing you're in league with the devil himself, and the other half is too scared to say otherwise. They're talking of coming out here tonight." Jed's heart sank. He looked towards the line shack, hidden in the distance. He had to get Nakai out of there. But where could he go? He was still too weak to travel far. To send him out into the wilderness was to condemn him to a slower but no less certain death. It was then that Nakai made a decision of his own. He had overheard Gus's words, and he understood the danger he had brought upon Jed. He stood up, his body still weak, but his resolve firm. He pointed to the north towards the distant mountains that were his home. "I go," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "You'll never make it," Jed said, his voice betraying more concern than he intended. "You're not strong enough." Nakai looked at Jed, his dark eyes filled with a surprising intensity. "You, good man," he said. "You, not die. For me." Before Jed could argue, they heard the sound of approaching horses. It was Sheriff Brody and his deputy. Jed's hand went to his gun, but Gus stopped him. "Hold on, boy," he said. "Let's hear what the man has to say." Sheriff Brody dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene. He looked at Jed, then at Nakai, who stood in the doorway of the line shack, a silent, dignified figure. "Jedediah Brody," said, his voice tired, "you've got a whole heap of trouble brewing. You know I have to take him in. You take him in, and you're signing his death warrant." Jed said, his voice hard. "O'Doherty's mob will see to that." "I know," Brody admitted. "But if I don't, They'll come out here and kill you both. I'm trying to save your life, son." It was a classic Western standoff, a clash of loyalties and impossible choices. But before anyone could make a move, a new sound cut through the tense air. It was the sound of a lone rider coming in fast from the east. It was a young boy, no older than 12, his face streaked with dust and tears. He was from a neighboring ranch, the Petersons' place. "Sheriff," he cried, his voice choked with panic. "It's the Chiricahua. They've attacked our ranch. They've taken my ma and pa." The world seemed to stop. The Chiricahua, the same band that had attacked Nakai. The air crackled with a new, more immediate danger. The threat was no longer a lone, wounded man in a line shack. It was a real and present danger, a war party on the loose. And in that moment, a new desperate plan began to form in Jed's mind. A plan that was as audacious as it was dangerous. A plan that would either save them all or get them all killed. He looked at Nakai, then at the sheriff. "Sheriff," he said, his voice firm and clear, "I think our friend here might be the only one who can help us." The twist had come not from the town, but from the wilderness itself. The enemy was no longer each other, but a common foe, and their only hope lay in the hands of the man they had been ready to condemn. The news of the Chiricahua raid hit the small group at the Stone's Throw Ranch like a physical blow. The abstract fear of a hypothetical Apache threat had suddenly been replaced by the terrifying reality of a known and notoriously brutal enemy. The personal vendetta of Finn O'Doherty and the legal dilemma of Sheriff Brody were instantly dwarfed by a matter of life and death. Sheriff Brody, a man accustomed to dealing with drunken brawls and petty theft, was out of his depth. He had a handful of deputies, none of them seasoned fighters, and the army at Fort Grant was a day's ride away. By the time they arrived, the Peterson family would be long dead. It was in this moment of desperation that Jed's audacious plan took shape. He turned to Nakai, who had listened to the boy's frantic story with a grim intensity. "You know the Chiricahua," Jed said, not as a question, but as a statement. "You know how they think, how they move." Nakai nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "They are like the scorpion," he said, his voice low and guttural. "They strike fast, and their poison is deadly." "Can you track them?" Jed pressed his voice, urgent. Nakai's gaze shifted to Jed, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "They are my enemy," he said simply. "I will hunt them." Sheriff Brody looked from Jed to Nakai, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. "You're suggesting we trust him, a wanted man. An Apache. He's the only one who knows the territory as well as they do," Jed argued. "He's our only chance of finding the Petersons before it's too late. What other choice do we have? Wait for O'Doherty and his lynch mob to show up and start a war with the wrong Indians?" The logic, however unconventional, was undeniable. Brody, a man of the law, was being asked to put his faith in a man he was supposed to arrest. It was a gamble, a huge one, but the lives of a family hung in the balance. He looked at the terrified face of the young Peterson boy, and his decision was made. "All right, Stone," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his choice. "We'll do it your way. But he rides with me, and if he tries anything, I'll put a bullet in him myself." A fragile and deeply unconventional alliance was formed. Jed Gus, Sheriff Brody, his deputy, Charlie, and Nakai. It was a motley crew, a microcosm of the divided West, united by a common purpose. They left immediately, a small, determined posse riding out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. As they rode, the animosity between them slowly began to dissolve, replaced by a grudging respect. Nakai, despite his weakened state, was a master of his craft. He read the landscape like a book, pointing out signs that the others would have missed, a broken twig, a displaced stone, the faint impression of a hoof-print in the hard-baked earth. He moved with a silent, an almost ghostly grace, a man in his element. Jed rode beside him, a silent observer. He watched Nakai not as an Apache, but as a man, a skilled tracker, a warrior in his own right. The hatred that had been so deeply ingrained in him was being replaced by something else, something he couldn't yet name. It was a disorienting and deeply unsettling experience. They tracked the Chiricahua for hours, the trail leading them deeper into the rugged mountainous terrain that was the Chiricahua's stronghold. It was a dangerous game. They were a small party entering the lion's den. The tension was palpable, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible ambush. As dusk began to fall, Nakai signaled for them to halt. He pointed to a narrow canyon ahead. "They are there," he whispered. "They will make camp for the night." The group dismounted, their hearts pounding in their chests. They crept forward, taking cover behind a ridge of rocks that overlooked the canyon. Below them, they saw the flickering light of a campfire. The Chiricahua warriors were gathered around it, their painted faces illuminated by the flames. And there, tied to a tree, were Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, their faces pale with terror. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through the small posse. They were outnumbered at least 3-1. A direct assault would be suicide. They needed a plan, a way to even the odds. It was then that Gus, the old, weathered ranch hand, spoke up. He had been a scout for the army in his younger days, and he knew a thing or two about strategy. "We can't take them head on," he said, his voice a low whisper. "But we can use the element of surprise. We can create a diversion, draw some of them away, and then go in for the Petersons." The plan was risky, but it was the only one they had. As they huddled together planning their attack, a new and unexpected player entered the game. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dying sun. It was Finn O'Doherty. He had followed them, his face a mask of drunken determination. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, a ragtag army of about 20 men, the lynch mob from Redemption, was riding hard. O'Doherty had not come to help. He had come for his own brand of justice, and in his drunken state, he was about to turn a desperate rescue mission into a bloodbath. The unlikely alliance was about to face its greatest test, not from the Chiricahua in the canyon below, but from the so-called civilized men at their backs. The night was about to explode into a symphony of chaos and violence, and Jed and his companions were caught squarely in the middle. The arrival of Finn O'Doherty and his mob of vigilantes was a match thrown into a powder keg. They were a chaotic, disorganized force, fueled by whiskey and a self-righteous fury. They saw the campfire in the canyon below, and without a moment's hesitation, they let out a series of drunken war cries and charged down the slope, their guns blazing. "You damn fools!" Sheriff Brody yelled, his voice lost in the sudden cacophony of gunfire. "You'll get us all killed!" The element of surprise, their only advantage, was gone. The Chiricahua, caught off guard, but quick to react, returned fire. The canyon erupted into a maelstrom of bullets and death. Jed, Gus, Brody, and Charlie were caught in the crossfire. They were pinned down behind their rocky outcrop, with the Chiricahua in front of them, and O'Doherty's reckless mob to their side. It was a battle on two fronts, a chaotic, swirling vortex of violence. It was in this moment of sheer chaos that Nakai proved his worth. He was no longer a wounded man, a prisoner. He was a warrior. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his recent injuries. He pointed out the positions of the Chiricahua warriors, their strengths and weaknesses, his voice a calm, steady presence in the midst of the storm. There, he would whisper, pointing to a warrior reloading behind a tree. Now, and Jed or Brody or Gus would take the shot. They became a cohesive fighting unit. Their movements synchronized, their actions guided by the Apache scout they had so recently distrusted. The battle raged on a brutal close-quarters affair. Men fell on both sides. O'Doherty's mob, with no real leadership or strategy, was being decimated. O'Doherty himself, in a moment of drunken bravado, stood up to take a shot and was immediately cut down, a look of stunned surprise on his face as he fell to the dusty ground. As the fighting intensified, Jed found himself fighting alongside Nakai, the two of them back to back, a strange and unlikely partnership. The hatred that had once consumed him was a distant memory burned away in the crucible of battle. In its place was a grudging respect, a bond forged in shared danger. They managed to push the Chiricahua back to create an opening. Now Gus yelled. For the Petersons, Jed and Sheriff Brody made a break for it, dashing across the open ground towards the tree where the Petersons were tied. They cut them loose and began to lead them back towards the relative safety of the rocks. But the Chiricahua were not so easily defeated. Their leader, a fearsome warrior with a face painted in the colors of death, let out a piercing war cry and charged, his tomahawk raised. He was a whirlwind of fury, a seemingly unstoppable force. He was heading straight for Jed and the Petersons. Jed raised his pistol, but it was empty. He was defenseless. He braced himself for the killing blow. But it never came. Nakai, with a speed that seemed almost supernatural, threw himself in front of Jed, his own knife drawn. The two Apache warriors, the White Mountain Scout and the Chiricahua chieftain, met in a clash of steel and fury. It was a brutal primal dance of death, a fight that was not just about this battle, but about a long and bitter history of tribal warfare. The fight was short and savage. In the end, Nakai, with a final desperate lunge, drove his knife into the chieftain's heart. The fearsome warrior fell. His war cry silenced forever. The death of their leader broke the spirit of the remaining Chiricahua. They retreated, melting back into the darkness of the mountains from whence they came. Silence fell upon the canyon, a silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sobbing of Mrs. Peterson. The battle was over. The survivors, a battered and bloodied collection of settlers and a lone Apache, looked at each other in the dim light of the dying campfire. They had won, but the cost had been high. As the adrenaline began to fade, a new and unsettling reality began to set in. They had survived the battle, but the war was far from over. They were still in the heart of hostile territory. And now they had a new problem. Kind Miller and his troops from Fort Grant were on their way, drawn by the sound of the gunfire, and when they arrived, they would not see a heroic rescue. They would see a massacre, and they would see Nakai, a lone Apache, standing amongst the bodies of white men. In their eyes, there would be only one conclusion. The hero of the hour was about to become the prime suspect in a crime he did not commit. The first rays of dawn painted the canyon in hues of gray and rose, revealing the full extent of the night's carnage. The bodies of O'Doherty's men lay scattered across the battlefield, a grim testament to their foolishness. The surviving members of Jed's small party were exhausted, their faces streaked with soot and blood. They had saved the Petersons, but their victory was short-lived. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they heard the sound of approaching cavalry. It was Kind Miller and his troops, a column of blue-coated soldiers riding in perfect formation, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene they were about to encounter. Kind Miller was a man driven by ambition, a man who saw the West not as a place to build a home, but as a stepping stone in his military career. He was known for his harsh, uncompromising views on the Indian problem. He saw the world in black and white, and in his eyes, any Native American was a potential enemy. He rode into the canyon, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, calculating gaze. He saw the dead white men, the terrified Peterson family, and the small group of survivors. And he saw Nakai, standing beside Jed, his knife still stained with the blood of the Chiricahua chieftain. What in God's name happened here? Miller demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face weary but determined. There was a Chiricahua raid, Kind. They had taken the Petersons hostage. We were able to rescue them. Miller's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Nakai. And him, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. What's his part in this? It looks to me like an Apache massacre. You're wrong, Kind, Jed said, his voice firm. He's a white mountain Apache. He helped us. He saved our lives. He killed the Chiricahua leader. Miller scoffed, a look of utter disbelief on his face. A friendly Apache, I've heard that story before. It usually ends with a knife in the back. I'm placing him under arrest. He'll be taken to Fort Grant for interrogation. Interrogation? Brody said, his voice rising in anger. You mean a hanging? You're not taking him, Miller. He's under my jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction ended the moment this became a military matter, Miller retorted. And a dozen dead white men makes it a military matter. Now stand aside, Sheriff, or I'll place you under arrest for obstructing a military operation. It was a standoff, a clash of wills between the civilian lawman and the ambitious soldier. Miller's men had their rifles at the ready, their faces grim and unyielding. Jed, Gus, and Brody were outnumbered and outgunned. It was in this tense and volatile moment that Mrs. Peterson, a woman who had been through an unimaginable ordeal, found her voice. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. That man, she said, her voice trembling but clear, pointing at Nakai. He is a hero. He saved my husband and me. He fought with more courage and honor than any man I have ever seen. If you take him, you will be committing a grave injustice. Her words, spoken with such raw emotional power, gave Miller pause. But his ambition was a stronger force than his conscience. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. But I have my orders. Arrest him. Two of Miller's soldiers moved towards Nakai, their rifles pointed at his chest. Jed stepped in front of him, his own pistol drawn. You'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice low and steady. It was a suicidal gesture, a moment of pure, unadulterated defiance. Gus and Brody moved to stand beside him, their own weapons drawn. The three of them, a rancher, a lawman, and an old scout, were making a last desperate stand for the man who had saved them. The tension was so thick it was almost a physical presence. A single gunshot would be enough to ignite a new and even more tragic battle. The fate of Nakai, and perhaps of them all, hung in the balance. And then something unexpected happened. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder, echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of a drum, a steady rhythmic beat. And then another and another. A chorus of voices singing a deep, resonant chant joined the drums. On the ridges overlooking the canyon, figures began to appear. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted not for war, but for a solemn ceremony. They were from the White Mountain tribe, Naki's people. They had come for their lost scout, but they had found something else. They had found him standing with a group of white men who were willing to die for him. Kind Miller and his soldiers stared in stunned disbelief. They were surrounded. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. The arrival of the White Mountain Apache had changed everything. The standoff was no longer about law or military orders. It was about something much older, much more powerful. It was about honor and justice and the deep, unbreakable bonds that could be forged in the crucible of the American West. The silence that followed the retreat of the Chiricahua was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to crest the canyon walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to cling to the fallen. It was into this fragile, exhausted quiet that the sound of the cavalry arrived, a sharp, metallic intrusion of jingling harnesses and rhythmic hoofbeats. Kind Miller, astride a proud bay, led his column of blue-coated soldiers into the scene, his face a mask of stern authority. His eyes, cold and analytical, swept across the carnage. He saw the sprawled bodies of the white men from Redemption, the terrified but safe Peterson family, huddled together, and the small, battle-worn group led by Sheriff Brody. His gaze, however, lingered and hardened on Nakai, who stood beside Jed, his knife still slick with the blood of the Chiricahua chieftain, his posture unbowed despite his weariness. What in God's name happened here? Miller's voice was a whip crack cutting through the morning air. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with fatigue, stepped forward to meet him. A Chiricahua war party kind. They'd taken the Petersons. We managed to get them back. Miller's lip curled in a sneer as his eyes locked onto Nakai. And him? What's his part in this little drama? Looks to me like you stumbled into an Apache massacre. Sheriff, you're dead wrong. Kind. Jed's voice was raw, but it didn't waver. He moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Brody. That man is Nakai of the White Mountain Apache. The Chiricahua are his enemies as much as ours. He tracked them. He fought with us. He saved our lives. Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. A friendly Apache. A convenient story, Mr. Stone. I've heard dozens like it, and they usually end with a settler's scalp missing. I'm placing him under arrest. He'll be taken to Fort Grant for interrogation. The word hung in the air, a euphemism for something far darker. You mean a trial with a predetermined verdict and a short rope? Brody shot back, his own anger flaring. You're not taking him, Miller. He's a material witness, and he's under my jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction evaporated the moment this became a bloodbath involving a dozen dead white men. Miller countered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. This is a military matter now. Stand aside, Sheriff, or I'll have you arrested for obstructing my command. He motioned to his men, whose rifles were already held at a low ready. It was a standoff, the weary civilian lawman, against the unyielding ambition of the U.S. Army. But before the impasse could break into violence, it was a woman's voice that cut through the tension. Mrs. Peterson, her dress torn and her face stained with tears and dust, pushed past her husband and stood before the kind. Her voice, though trembling, was filled with a formidable strength born of trauma and gratitude. "That man," she declared, pointing a shaking finger at Nakai, "is a hero. He is the reason my husband and I are alive to see this dawn. He fought with more courage and more honor than anyone here. If you take him, if you harm him, you will not be serving justice. You will be committing a sin in the eyes of God." Her raw, heartfelt testimony gave even Miller a moment's pause, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. But it was a fleeting thing, quickly extinguished by the fires of his ambition. "I appreciate your emotional state, ma'am," he said, his tone patronizingly dismissive. "But I have my orders, and my duty is clear. Arrest the savage." Two soldiers, their faces impassive, stepped forward, their rifles now leveled at Nakai's chest. In a heartbeat, Jed was between them, his own Colt Peacemaker appearing in his hand as if by magic. "You'll have to come through me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Gus and Sheriff Brody immediately flanked him, their own weapons drawn. The three of them, a rancher whose heart had been remade, a lawman clinging to true justice, and an old scout who knew honor when he saw it, formed a desperate, defiant line in the sand. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes darting to their kind. The canyon held its breath. A single twitchy finger would unleash a second, even more senseless massacre. And then it began, a sound from beyond the canyon walls. Faint at first, it was a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of their boots. A drum. Then another joined it, and another, until the air thrummed with a steady, powerful heartbeat. A low, guttural chant rose to meet the rhythm, a sound that was ancient and elemental. On the high ridges overlooking the canyon, figures began to materialize against the morning sky. Silhouettes at first, they resolved into the forms of Apache warriors. Dozens of them. Then scores. Soon the entire rim of the canyon was lined with a silent, imposing army. They were not painted for war. Their faces were adorned with the solemn markings of ceremony. It was Naki's people. The White Mountain Apache had come seeking their lost scout. Kind Miller's face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks. His soldiers fidgeted, their military discipline cracking under the weight of 100 pairs of unblinking eyes. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. A warrior, clearly a man of great authority, began a slow, deliberate descent into the canyon. His face was a mask of stoic dignity, carved with the lines of wisdom and command. It was Cochise. He was flanked by several elders, and their presence radiated an authority that made Miller's military rank seem like a child's plaything. Cochise's gaze swept over the scene, his eyes missing nothing: the dead Chiricahua, the fallen vigilantes, the terrified Petersons, the defiant knot of men protecting his scout. His eyes finally came to rest on Nakai, and a flicker of profound relief crossed his features before he turned his attention to the white men. He spoke, and his voice, though not loud, carried to every corner of the canyon. Nakai, standing straighter now, translated. "We came to find our brother Cochise," began, his eyes locking onto Jed. "We tracked him here, expecting to find his body and bring him home for the last songs. Instead, we find him alive. We find him shielded by men who share the skin of those who have taken our lands and our lives. My scouts have watched since the first gunshot. They have told me of the battle. They told of the foolish ones who charged to their deaths, and of the brave ones who fought a battle not their own." His gaze moved to the bodies of the Chiricahua. "You have done us a service. The scorpion eaters have been a thorn in our side for many seasons." Then his eyes, hard as flint, settled on kind Miller. And now we see this man in the blue coat. He did not fight. He did not bleed. Yet he comes now to pass judgment, to claim a man of honor as a prize. This is not the way of a leader. This is the way of a vulture who comes only after the warriors have departed. Humiliation and fury warred on Miller's face, but he remained silent, trapped and powerless. Cochise dismounted with a fluid grace and walked toward Jed's group, stopping a few feet away. He looked directly at Jed, a long, appraising stare that seemed to see into the very core of his soul. "The scouts told me your name, Jedediah Stone. They told me of your family's fate. They told me you found my scout dying on your land, a man you had every reason to hate. Yet you did not leave him to the sun. You gave him water, you gave him shelter, you stood against your own people for him. You stood against this soldier for him. You have a strong heart." Cochise turned and spoke to his warriors. 2 men came forward, their movements full of reverence. They carried a blanket folded carefully. As they unfurled it, a gasp went through the small group of white men. It was a masterpiece, woven with intricate geometric patterns in deep reds, earthy browns, and a brilliant turquoise that seemed to capture the color of the sky. It was more than a blanket. It was a story, a history woven in wool. They laid this sacred object at Jedediah's feet. "This is the gift of my people," Cochise declared, his voice resonating with solemnity. "It is a blanket of protection. The patterns tell the story of this day of the enemy defeated, of the strangers who became brothers. So long as this blanket is with you, you and all who dwell under your roof are as our own family. The people of the White Mountains will be your friends. No arrow of ours will ever be pointed at your ranch. Our warriors will be your guardians. You are a brother to us." It was a gesture of immense power, an alliance forged not on paper, but in honor. Cochise then turned to Nakai, and they spoke in the flowing musical tones of their own language. It was a conversation of deep respect between a chief and his warrior. Finally, Nakai turned to Jed, his eyes shining. "My chief gives me a choice," he said. "I have fulfilled my duty. I can return with them to our home in the mountains." Or he paused. "He says a man can have 2 homes. He says I can stay here with my brother, who stood ready to die for me." Jed looked at the man before him. The image of the hated Apache in the creek bed was gone forever, replaced by the face of a friend, a brother forged in fire. He felt a lump form in his throat. "Stay, Nakai." Jed managed his voice thick. He clasped Nakai's shoulder. "The stone's throw is your home now, too." A quiet understanding passed between them, more powerful than any words. Defeated kind Miller gave a curt, bitter order. His soldiers, looking relieved to be leaving, mounted up and rode out of the canyon, a retreat in all but name. The White Mountain Apache remained. They helped bury the dead, showing a quiet reverence for all, even the foolish men from redemption. As the sun set, they departed as they had come, a silent, ghostly procession, melting back into the mountains, their drums a fading echo on the evening breeze. Riding back to the ranch with Gus and the Petersons ahead, Jed and Nakai rode side by side. The sacred blanket was draped carefully over Jed's saddle. He looked at the endless, rugged landscape, a land that had taken everything from him. But today, it had given something back. It had given him a brother. The West was still a dangerous, unforgiving place. But for Jedediah Stone, it was no longer empty. It was home. And so the tale of Jedediah Stone and Nakai became a whisper on the wind, a legend told around campfires across the vast expanse of the West. It's a story that reminds us that even in the most unforgiving of landscapes, in the hearts of men, hardened by loss and prejudice, the seeds of compassion and understanding can take root and blossom in the most unexpected ways. It's a testament to the fact that true courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. That true honor isn't about vengeance, but about justice and mercy. If this story of an unlikely friendship and a sacred gift resonated with you, if it stirred something in your soul, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more tales from the heart of the American West, more stories of courage, conflict, and the enduring power of the human spirit, then be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.